In 2016, President Barack Obama stood in the shadow of El Capitan at Yosemite National Park, and to the applause of roaring crowds, declared America's national parks to be America's best idea. Obama celebrated the beautiful scenery and the importance of public lands for creating spaces of serenity and health for future generations. Yet the president's speech made no reference to the original inhabitants of the Peaceful Valley, the Ahwahnechee Native American people, whose lands were violently expropriated by the federal government to create Yosemite National Park in 1890. My senior thesis explores how Native American tribes, including the Ahwahnechee, have suffered violence and dispossession in the name of conservation at America's national parks. Though the roots of violence against Indigenous peoples began with the arrival of Columbus in 1492, the creation of the National Park Service in the late 19th century represented the advent of a new era, in which ideas of a mythical pristine wilderness were used to justify the genocide of Native people at the national parks. The concept of pristine wilderness was championed by the three fathers of American conservation: Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, and Madison Grant. To quote Theodore Roosevelt, the three men hoped that the national parks would serve as a great natural playground for American children to learn the pleasure of the hardy life of the wilderness. Through romanticizing popular images of nature, Roosevelt, Muir, and Grant bequeathed the conservation lands they had stolen as a birthright for future generations of Euro-American children. Yet for the descendants of the indigenous communities whose lands were stolen to realize that vision, the early conservation movement marked the onset of an era of exclusion from their own lands. In the case of the Ahwahnechee, their centuries-long stewardship ended abruptly in 1890, when the National Park Service prohibited the tribe from hunting and gathering traditional foods at Yosemite. Facing starvation, they were pushed into low-paying jobs offered by the National Park Service, including serving as exotic attractions for tourists who came to Yosemite hoping to see the so-called vanishing Indians. Even their homes were subject to scrutiny by the Park Service, who often entered Yosemite's Indian village without a warrant to inspect native residences. Abuses by the government and the Park Service against the tribe continue today, as the Ahwahnechee people remain federally unrecognized and thus do not have the ability to negotiate their rights as a sovereign nation. Despite the tragedy and trauma that the national parks represent for many Native communities, they also represent spaces of abundant care, cultural meaning, and stewardship. 4 national parks have moved to models of Indigenous co-management within the National Park Service. Though there remain many barriers to creating a shared vision of conservation and inclusive management at the national parks, projects of co-management provide hope for a future of American conservation that focuses on bringing in the voices of Indigenous peoples who call the national parks their home.